My name is Allison Crane, and I was 27 years old the day my grandmother's will was read in a small room above the funeral home. The family gathered in folding chairs, still in black, still smelling of flowers. The envelope was handed to my mother last, not because it was unimportant, because my grandmother had written across the front in blue ink, "For Denise, when everyone else has gone home." My mother opened it alone in the kitchen that night. She did not just cry. She did not just scream. She passed out in front of everyone before she reached the second paragraph. And what that letter said changed everything I thought I knew about who raised me and who let her. Denise Crane was the kind of mother other mothers admired. Organized, warm in public, always at school events with the right dish. She raised me alone after my father left when I was 3, and she made sure I never felt like I was missing anything. But my grandmother saw something else. She lived with us the last 5 years of her life, and she watched Denise in ways I never did. The letter she left was not addressed to me, it was addressed to my mother. And inside it was a name I had never heard, a date I did not understand, and a confession that meant the woman who raised me had been keeping the hardest truth from the one person who deserved to know it. What I found in that envelope forced me to ask a question I was not ready for. If my mother lied about who she was, what else had she spent 30 years burying? The name in the envelope was Margaret Holloway, not a relative, not a friend my mother ever mentioned, just a name typed on yellowed paper, folded inside my grandmother's handwriting. The letter explained that Margaret Holloway had been a social worker at St. Catherine's Hospital in Baltimore, and that in June of 1985, she had handled a private adoption that my mother had never told anyone about. My mother was 17 years old that summer. She had just finished her junior year of high school, and according to my grandmother, she gave birth to a baby boy in a room with no windows and signed papers she was told would seal the record forever. The father was not named. My grandmother wrote that she had driven my mother to the hospital herself, stayed in the waiting room, and never spoke of it again. Not to her husband, not to her friends, not once in the 38 years that followed. She said she carried that silence like a stone lodged beneath her ribs, and that she was leaving the letter because she could not carry it into the grave without telling someone. She chose me. I was 27 when I read those words. I had just buried the only person in my family who had ever looked at me with something close to recognition. Eleanor Crane was my maternal grandmother, and she had lived with us from the time I was 13 until the week she died. She slept in the back bedroom, wore slippers with worn soles, and watched the news with the volume turned low so she could hear who was walking through the house. She knew things about my mother that I only started to understand after she was gone. The way my mother tensed around newborns, the way she changed the subject whenever someone mentioned adoption, the way she kept a small photograph hidden inside a book of poetry on the highest shelf in her closet. I found that photograph the night after the funeral. I was looking for the death certificate when my hand brushed against the spine of a book that did not belong with the others. It was a collection of Emily Dickinson poems, printed in 1982 with a cracked leather binding. Inside, tucked between pages 90 and 91, was a Polaroid of a woman in hospital scrubs holding a bundled infant. On the back, written in blue ink, were 2 words, Margaret Holloway, and a date, June 14, 1985. That photograph became the first thread. I spent the next 3 weeks trying to pull it without unraveling everything. I called St. Catherine's. The hospital had merged twice since the 1980s, and the records department told me that adoption files from that period had been transferred to a state archive after a privacy law change in 1998. I drove to Annapolis and spent 4 hours in a basement room with fluorescent lights and a microfiche machine. I found nothing under Denise Crane. I tried variations, Dennis Crane, Denise Crawford, nothing. Then I remembered the name Margaret Holloway. I searched for her separately. Margaret Holloway had retired from social work in 2002 and died in 2014. But before she died, she had donated her case files to a university library under a restricted access agreement. The library was in Pennsylvania, 2 hours north. I called them the next morning. The archivist told me they could not release the contents of the Holloway collection without a court order or a signed release from the birth parent. I told them I was the daughter of the birth parent. That was when the story started to bend in a direction I had not anticipated. The archivist paused, then asked for my mother's full name and date of birth. I gave it. She put me on hold. When she came back, her voice was lower. She said that according to their index, The file associated with my mother had been accessed once before, in 2019, by someone who presented themselves as the adopted child. The name on the request form was Thomas Crane Mercer. I wrote it down, Thomas. My mother had named him, or my grandmother had, or Margaret Holloway had chosen it from a list. But the last name was Crane, my mother's maiden name. And the middle name, Mercer, was the surname of the man my mother married 3 years later, the man who became my father. The adopted child had found his birth mother's name, and someone had let him through. I sat in my car in the library parking lot and did not move for a long time. Thomas Crane Mercer had requested that file in 2019, 4 years before my grandmother died, 5 years before the letter was even written. He had found Denise, which meant he had found us. The question I could not answer was whether my mother knew. I called her that evening. She answered on the 5th ring, which was unusual. She sounded tired, not defensive, not guarded, just tired in a way that made me think she already knew what I was about to say. I told her I had found the photograph. I told her I had called the archive. I told her the name Thomas Crane Mercer. She did not ask how I found it. She did not deny it. She said, he came to the house last year. Then she stopped talking. I waited. When she spoke again, her voice was different. She said, your grandmother told him, before she died. She wrote him a letter too. He showed up at the front door on a Tuesday morning in September. I almost called the police, but I knew who he was before he said a word. I knew from the shape of his face. That was the moment everything I thought I knew about my mother cracked open. She had not been keeping a secret. She had been living inside one that was already walking around in the world. And the person who had set it free was the same woman who had helped her bury it in the first place. My grandmother had written 2 letters, one to my mother, one to the son she had never met. And she had waited until after her death to let both of them land. I asked my mother what happened after Thomas showed up. She said, I told him I was not ready. I told him to give me time. I asked if she had seen him again. She said no. Then she said something that made the room go still. But he calls me every month, on the 14th, and I answer every time. It was June the night we had that conversation. I looked at the calendar on my phone. The 14th was in 2 days. And I realized I had a brother I had never seen, who had been reaching toward us for years, while the woman who raised me held the door half open. I called him the next morning before I could talk myself out of it. I found his number through a public records search, which took less than 10 minutes and felt like the most invasive thing I had ever done. The phone rang 4 times. Then a voice, male, mid-30s, cautious. He said hello the way people do when they already know who is calling but are waiting for proof. I said my name. There was a pause long enough to hold the distance between 2 lives. Then he said, Allison, I wondered when you would call. He did not sound surprised. He sounded relieved, maybe, or resigned, as if he had been waiting for this moment since the day he learned he had a sister. He told me he had found our mother in 2019 after 6 years of searching. He had been adopted by a couple in Pennsylvania, told the truth at age 12, and started looking for biological family when he turned 18. The adoption agency gave him non-identifying information, medical history, ethnic background, a description of the birth mother as a 17-year-old high school student from Baltimore. That was enough to start. He used online databases, DNA testing, and finally a genealogist who matched him to a maternal cousin in Ohio. That cousin gave him my grandmother's name, and my grandmother, without telling anyone, wrote him back. He sent me a copy of her letter. I read it while sitting on the floor of my apartment with the phone pressed to my ear. The handwriting was the same as the one I had found in my mother's closet, thin blue cursive on lined paper. My grandmother told him she had waited 34 years to write those words. She told him that his birth mother had been forced into silence by shame and by her own mother, my great-grandmother, who had insisted the pregnancy be hidden. She told him his father was a boy from the neighborhood, 18 at the time, who had moved away before the birth and never knew. She told him she had held him once in the hospital and that she had never stopped wondering where he was. Then she gave him my mother's married name and address. She said, she will need time, but she has already mourned you every day of her life. Do not let her mourn alone. I asked Thomas if he had shown that letter to our mother. He said no, because he wanted to tell her in person. When he arrived at her door in September of 2023, he brought the letter with him and handed it to her before he said a word. She read it on the front steps. Then she asked him to leave. He did, but he left his phone number inside the envelope. And she called him 3 days later. That was where his story and my mother's story began to diverge. She told me he had called every month. He told me he had called every month and she had answered, but she had never once asked him a question. She let him talk. She let him tell her about his job, his wife, his daughter who was born in 2021. She listened, but she never offered anything in return. He said, "I know more about her silence than I know about her life, and I do not know how long I can keep doing this." I understood that feeling better than I wanted to admit. The conversation lasted almost 2 hours. He asked about my work, my childhood, the city I lived in. He asked about our grandmother. He asked whether we looked alike. I did not have good answers for most of it, but by the end, we had agreed to meet. He lived in Philadelphia, just over 2 hours from where I was sitting. We chose a coffee shop in Delaware, neutral ground halfway, and I asked my mother if she wanted to come. She said no. She said she was not ready. Those were her words, not ready, as if readiness were something that would arrive like a package if she waited long enough. I told her I was going anyway. She did not try to stop me. She did not offer to drive. She just said, "Tell him I am thinking about him." I did not know whether to believe that. The day before the meeting, I drove to the library in Pennsylvania to see the Holloway files. I had a court order by then, expedited through a contact at the state attorney general's office. I was not going to show up in front of my brother without knowing everything I could. The archivist brought me a gray cardboard box. Inside were 37 pages, intake forms, hospital records, a single photograph of an infant, and a handwritten note from Margaret Holloway dated June 28, 1985. The note read, "Mother refused to hold the baby. Baby placed with foster family pending adoption. Mother signed surrender under duress from her mother. No father identified. Mother cried for 3 hours after signing. I am not sure she understood what she was doing." That note changed the shape of the story. My mother had not just given up a child and moved on. She had been 17, pressured by her own mother, in a hospital room with no windows, and she had cried for 3 hours. My grandmother had written that she drove her there, stayed, and never spoke of it. But she had not told me that part. She had left out the duress. She had left out the crying. I called my mother on the drive home. She answered, but she did not speak first. I told her I had seen the file. I told her I knew about Margaret Holloway's note. And then I asked her directly, "Did you want to keep him?" The silence that followed was not the silence of someone thinking. It was the silence of someone unlocking a door they had sworn to keep closed forever. She said, "I wanted to keep him more than I have ever wanted anything. And my mother told me I would ruin the family. She told me the only way to fix it was to forget it happened. So I tried. For 38 years, I tried, and I never succeeded even once." That was the moment I stopped seeing my mother as the woman who kept secrets. I started seeing her as the woman who was never allowed to choose. I arrived at the coffee shop at 10 in the morning on a Saturday in July. The place was small, brick walls, wooden floors, the kind of spot that feels intentional. I ordered tea because I needed something to hold. Thomas walked in at 10:07. He was taller than I expected, with dark hair and eyes that looked like the photograph of my mother at 18 that I had found in a family album. He wore a plaid shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and he was holding a copy of the same Emily Dickinson book my grandmother had used to hide the Polaroid. He sat down, set the book on the table between us, and said, "I thought you should have this. She mailed it to me a week before she died." I opened the cover. Inside was an inscription in my grandmother's handwriting. "For Thomas, who I held once and never forgot. Forgive her, she was only a girl." I closed the book. I did not know what to say. We talked for 4 hours. He told me about his adoptive parents, both schoolteachers, who had raised him in a small town near Lancaster. He told me he had always felt a gap inside himself that he could not name until he found out he was adopted. He told me his daughter's middle name was Aliner, after our grandmother. He told me he had sent my mother a photograph of the baby, and she had never acknowledged it. He said, "I don't know if she wants a relationship. I don't know if she's capable of it, but I needed to meet you. I needed to know that I was not alone in carrying this." I told him he was not alone. I told him I had felt invisible in my own family for years. I told him about the will reading, the letter, the way my mother had passed out in the kitchen. He listened the same way I had listened to him, without interruption, without judgment. The afternoon ended with an agreement. We would meet again in a month, and I would keep trying with our mother, but something had shifted in me during that conversation. I had started to realize that the person who had suffered most in this story was not me. It was not even Thomas. It was the 17-year-old girl who had been told that love was a threat to her family's reputation. And that girl was still inside my mother, still waiting for someone to tell her she had done nothing wrong. When I got home that night, there was a voicemail from my mother. She said, "I want to meet him. I want to try. Can you help me?" I called her back. I told her I would. But I also told her that my grandmother's silence had cost all of us something we would never get back, and that if we were going to move forward, she had to stop carrying the shame that was never hers to carry. She did not argue. She just said, "I know." The next morning, I called Thomas. I told him our mother was ready. He waited a long time before he answered. Then he said, "Tell her I will be there, and tell her I have already forgiven her." Reunion was set for the following Saturday at my apartment. My mother insisted on neutral ground, but when I offered the coffee shop again, she said no. She wanted a place where no one could watch her fall apart. I told her my building had a courtyard with a bench under a maple tree. She said that would be fine. Thomas drove down from Philadelphia with his wife, a woman named Corrine who taught elementary school and had the calm presence of someone used to holding space for hard conversations. They arrived at 11. My mother arrived at 11:13, which was late enough to suggest she had circled the block more than once. She was wearing a dress I had never seen before, navy blue with small white flowers, the kind of thing you buy for a wedding or a funeral. She was holding the Emily Dickinson book. Thomas stood when he saw her. He did not rush. He let her cross the courtyard at her own pace. When she reached the bench, she stopped and looked at him the way you look at a photograph that has come to life. She said his name, that was all. Thomas said, "Hi." Then they sat. Corrine and I moved to the other side of the courtyard to give them space. We did not speak. We just watched two strangers who shared blood try to find a language that would not break them. 40 minutes later, my mother stood up and walked toward me. Her eyes were wet, but her face was steady. She said, "He looks like my father. Did you notice that?" I had not. I had never met my maternal grandfather, who died when I was 6, but I nodded anyway. She said, "He told me he already knew my voice from the phone calls. He said I sound the way he always imagined I would." She paused. Then she said something I will never forget. I told him I was sorry it took me 38 years to say it out loud, and he said he had been saying it for me every day since he was 12 years old. She sat down on the bench next to me and cried like a woman who had been holding water in her lungs for decades. That afternoon became the first of many. Thomas stayed in town for 2 days. We had dinner at my apartment, the four of us, and my mother laughed for the first time in months. Corrine showed us photographs of their daughter, Eleanor, a toddler with dark curls and the same eyes as my mother's high school yearbook photo. My mother held the phone and did not let go for a long time. That night, after Thomas and Corrine left, my mother sat on my couch and said, "I wasted so many years being afraid of something that turned out to be the only gift I ever received." I believed her. But I also knew that secrets do not dissolve just because the truth is spoken. They leave residue. And the residue of a 38-year silence was about to surface in a way none of us anticipated. 2 weeks later, my mother called me at 6:00 a.m. on a Sunday. Her voice was different, tight, the same tone she had used the night she read the will. She said, "There is something else, something I should have told you before the meeting." I waited. She said, "The day Thomas was born, my mother brought someone to the hospital, a man. He was not my father. He was the father of the boy who got me pregnant." She said his name was Richard Holloway. He was Margaret Holloway's husband. And he was the one who had arranged the adoption. I did not understand at first. Then it hit me. Margaret Holloway was not just the social worker. She was connected to the family before Thomas was even born. The name on the file was not a coincidence. She had been chosen because she knew the father's family. I asked if Richard Holloway was related to the boy who had fathered Thomas. My mother said yes. She said, "His name was David Holloway. He was 18. His father made him leave town the week after I told him I was pregnant." I never saw him again. My mother had not told me his name. She had not told anyone, but my grandmother knew. And Margaret Holloway knew. And Richard Holloway had paid for the hospital stay and the legal fees and the sealed records. The entire adoption had been orchestrated by the paternal grandfather to protect his son's reputation. I asked my mother if she had ever tried to find David. She said, "I looked him up once about 10 years ago. He lives in Oregon. He owns a hardware store. He has a wife and 3 children." She paused. "I never contacted him. I was afraid of what I would do if he had forgotten me." I asked if Thomas knew. She said no. And she asked me not to tell him. Not yet. She said she needed to be the one to explain. I agreed. but I knew that holding another secret would only compound the damage. The next weekend, I drove to Oregon. I did not tell my mother. I did not tell Thomas. I found David Holloway at his hardware store, a place called Pioneer Supply on a main street in a small town near the coast. I walked in, bought a bottle of water, and asked the man at the counter if he was David Holloway. He said yes. I told him my name. I watched his face change from polite confusion to something deeper, older, a recognition that predated any words I could offer. He set down the box of nails he was holding and said, "You look like her." I asked if he meant my mother. He nodded. Then he said, "I have thought about her every single day for 38 years. I just did not think she would ever send someone to find me." We sat in the back of the store on overturned crates. He told me his father had forced him to leave Baltimore the morning after my mother told him she was pregnant. He did not know about Thomas until 10 years later, when a lawyer contacted him to say that the adoption had been finalized and he had no legal rights. He said he had tried to find my mother twice. Once in 1995, when he hired a private investigator who came up empty. And once in 2010, when he drove to Baltimore and sat outside her house for 3 hours before driving away. He said, "I did not know if she wanted to see me. I did not know if she blamed me. I blamed myself. I was a coward. I let my father send me away like a child, and I never fought hard enough to come back." I told him about Thomas. I told him about the letter, the will, the reunion. He wept. He said, "I have a grandson I have never met." I said, "You have a daughter you have never met, and she is 27 years old and standing in front of you." That was when the story turned again. David told me that his father, Richard Holloway, had died in 2015, but before he died, he had left a sealed envelope with instructions to deliver it to my mother if she ever came looking. The envelope was in a safe at the hardware store. He opened it in front of me. Inside was a letter from Richard Holloway, addressed to Denise Crane. It read, "I stole something from you that I could never give back. I have spent the rest of my life regretting it. I told my son you moved away. I told him you did not want to be found. I lied so that he would stop looking. I do not expect forgiveness. But I want you to know that I lied, and that your son was placed with good people, and that my son never stopped loving you." I held the letter in my hands and understood that the silence my mother had carried was not hers alone. It had been engineered by two families, by shame, by a system that protected boys and buried girls. I called my mother from the parking lot of the hardware store. I told her where I was. I told her what I had found. She did not yell. She did not cry. She just said, "Is he okay?" I said, "He is broken, but he is here." She said, "Ask him if he wants to meet Thomas." I walked back inside and gave David the phone. They talked for 12 minutes. When he handed the phone back, he said, "I am driving to Baltimore next week. I am going to meet my son, and I am going to apologize to your mother for every day I was not there." That was the final piece of the puzzle. The adoption was not a closed secret. It was a wound that 3 adults had conspired to keep infected, and the only people left to heal it were the ones who had been cut the deepest. The week after that, Thomas called me. He said my mother had told him about David. He said he had already received a voicemail from a man in Oregon who said he was his father. Thomas said, "I do not know what to do with this. I already have a father, a good one. But I also want to know where I came from." I told him that was not a betrayal of anyone. It was a right. He said, "Will you come with me when I meet him?" I said yes. Meeting was set for the first Saturday in September in the same coffee shop in Delaware where Thomas and I had first met. My mother refused to come. She said she was not ready to see David again. I did not push. Thomas and I sat at the same table, the same chairs, the same time. David arrived at 10:00 on the dot. He was wearing a pressed shirt and held a small box. He set the box on the table and said, "This is for you. It was supposed to be given to you the day you were born." Thomas opened it. Inside was a silver bracelet with a single engraving, "Thomas Crane, June 14, 1985, 7 pounds, 4 ounces. David said, "I ordered it the week after I found out your mother was pregnant. I never got to give it to her. I have carried it with me for 38 years. Thomas put the bracelet on. He did not take it off. The 3 of us sat there for hours, building a bridge out of broken pieces. And by the end of it, I realized that the envelope my grandmother left was never just about a secret. It was about restoration. It was about telling the truth so that the people left behind could finally stop carrying the weight alone. That night, I called my mother one last time. I told her the meeting had gone well. She was quiet. Then she said, "I am going to see him next week, alone." She did not ask for my permission. She did not ask for my advice. She just told me as if she had finally decided to stop waiting for readiness and start acting. I said, "Do you want me to come?" She said no. She said, "I need to close this the way it should have been closed a long time ago." I told her I understood, and I did. The next week she drove to Oregon. She stayed for 3 days. Thomas and I heard from her only once, a text message with a photograph of a sunset over the Pacific Ocean. No caption. I showed it to Thomas. He smiled and said, "She looks free." And that was the beginning of the end. Not a clean end. Not a happy one in the way those stories usually go, but the kind of end where people stop hiding and start living with what they have. And sometimes, that is the only ending worth writing. My mother returned from Oregon a different woman, not in any dramatic way that strangers would notice. She still moved the same way, spoke the same way, folded her hands the same way when she sat, but something behind her eyes had shifted from guarded to present. She called me the morning after she got back and asked if I wanted to have lunch. That had never happened before. She had always waited for me to call her. We met at a diner near my apartment, the kind with vinyl booths and coffee that arrives before you ask. She ordered a sandwich, which was notable because my mother had not ordered a sandwich in public in my memory. She always ordered salad, as if watching her weight was a public duty. She said, "David wants to move east. He is selling the hardware store. He wants to be near Thomas and the baby." I asked what she thought about that. She said, "I think he has a right to know his grandchild. And I think I have spent enough time being afraid of what people will say." She looked at me, then in a way she had not looked at me in years. She said, "I am sorry I made you carry my silence. That was never your burden. You were my child, and I treated you like a confidant when I should have protected you." I did not know how to answer that, so I just nodded. Thomas called later that week with news of his own. He and Corrine were planning to move to Maryland. He had found a job at a law firm in Baltimore. He said he wanted his daughter to grow up near her grandmother. He said it without hesitation, using the word grandmother as if it had always been there. I asked if he had told Denise. He said, "I told her." She cried, but she did not say no. That was the pattern of the months that followed. Each small step forward was taken carefully, as if everyone involved understood that trust had to be rebuilt one conversation at a time. David sold his house in Oregon and bought a small place outside Annapolis. He visited Thomas twice a month. He sent Alina a birthday gift that arrived 3 days early because he could not wait. My mother started seeing David twice a week, then 3 times. They did not move in together. They did not rush. But they began to reconstruct the life that had been taken from them. Then came the day that changed everything again. It was November, just before Thanksgiving. My mother called and asked me to come to her house. She said she had found something while cleaning out my grandmother's closet, something that had been hidden behind a loose board in the wall. I drove over that evening. She met me at the door holding a small metal safe, the kind you buy at an office supply store, fireproof with a combination lock. She said, "I found it this morning. I do not know the combination." I tried every date I could think of. Nothing worked. I looked at the safe. It was old, probably from the 1980s. The lock was a simple 3-digit dial. I tried 614, June 14, Thomas's birthday. It opened. My mother went pale. Inside was a single envelope, thicker than the others, with my name written across the front in my grandmother's handwriting. The envelope was sealed with wax. I broke it open. Inside was a letter, a photograph, and a set of legal documents. The letter began, "Allison, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you have found the truth I spent my life burying. There is one more thing you need to know. Your mother was not the only one who lost someone. I lost a daughter long before I buried her. When Denise gave birth to Thomas, I made her promise to never speak of it. I thought I was protecting the family. I was wrong. I was protecting my own reputation. And in doing that, I broke something between us that never fully healed. But I want you to understand something. Your father, Paul, was not your mother's first love. He was the man she married after she had been broken. And he never knew about Thomas because I told her that if she told him, I would cut her off entirely. I gave her an impossible choice, and she chose to keep me. That is the guilt I carry. She chose me over honesty, and I never thanked her for it. So I am leaving you this. The photograph is of your mother holding Thomas the day he was born. The only copy that exists. The documents are the original adoption surrender papers, signed under duress, with my signature as witness. I kept them because I knew one day someone would need to prove that she did not abandon him willingly. She was forced, by me. I looked at the photograph. My mother, 17, thin, exhausted, holding a newborn with an expression of stunned love. I had never seen her face like that in my life. I handed it to her. She held it the way you hold something you have been told never to touch. She said, "I remember that moment. I remember thinking he was perfect. And then your grandmother took him from my arms and handed him to a nurse, and I never held him again." She did not cry. She just held the photograph and did not let go. The legal documents included a handwritten note from Margaret Holloway, dated June 28, 1985, that matched the one I had seen at the archive. But there was also a second note, dated July 2, 1985, addressed to my grandmother. It said, "Elinor, the adoption has been finalized. The boy is with a good family, but I need you to know that what you did was wrong. You took a child from a mother who loved him." I have facilitated hundreds of adoptions, and I have never seen a mother fight harder to keep her baby. You threatened her. You told her she would be disowned. You called her selfish. I am writing this so that one day someone knows the truth. I cannot report you because I am bound by confidentiality, but I am ashamed of my role in this. I am returning your payment. I want no part of this silence. My grandmother had kept that note. She had kept the evidence of her own coercion. And she had left it for me. I looked at my mother. She was still holding the photograph. I said, "She kept this. She kept proof of what she did. She could have destroyed it. She chose not to." My mother said, "She wanted you to know. She wanted someone to know that I was not the villain in this story." I said, "You never were." That night, I drove home with the documents and the photograph. I made copies. I filed them with a lawyer I trusted. I told Thomas everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "So our grandmother was the gatekeeper of all of it?" I said yes. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I am glad I got to know her before she died. I am glad she wrote me that letter. But I am also glad I know the full truth, because now I can forgive her honestly. Not because she was perfect, because she was human and she tried to make it right at the end." I thought about that. The grandmother I remembered was the woman who slept in the back bedroom, who watched the news with the volume low, who hid a Polaroid in a book of poems. She was also the woman who had forced a 17-year-old to give up her child and then spent 38 years trying to atone. Both things were true. And I understood that holding both truths at the same time was the only way to move forward. By the spring, the shape of our family had changed. My mother and David were planning a small wedding, not in a church, but in the courtyard where she had first met Thomas. They wanted it to be private. They wanted only the people who had survived the truth to be there. That meant me, Thomas, Corrine, Elinor, and a few close friends. My father, Paul, had been told. He had taken it the way he took most things, with quiet acceptance and no visible emotion. He had remarried years earlier and lived in Florida. He sent my mother a card. It said, "I hope you find the happiness you always deserved." That was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. The wedding happened in April under the maple tree. My mother wore a simple white dress. David wore a linen suit. Thomas walked her down the aisle, which was not planned, but which happened because he was standing next to her when the music started, and she took his arm without thinking. Elinor threw flower petals from a basket, most of which ended up on the ground before she reached the front. The photographer was Corrine, using her phone. It was not a polished event. It was not the kind of wedding my grandmother would have organized. It was real. At the reception, which was catered by the same Italian restaurant from the original dinner in Washington, my mother pulled me aside. She said, "I want you to know something. That night at the funeral, when I opened the envelope and passed out, it was not because of the shock. It was because I knew that your grandmother had finally told the truth, and I had spent my whole life waiting for her to do that. I passed out because I realized I was free. I just did not know how to live with it yet." I hugged her. She held on longer than she ever had. Then she said, "You are the reason I survived this. Do you understand that? You were the one who went to the library. You were the one who found Thomas. You were the one who drove to Oregon. You did what I was too afraid to do." I told her she would have done the same. She said, "I would like to think so, but I am not sure I will ever know." That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat in the courtyard alone. I looked up at the maple tree. I thought about my grandmother, about the letter she had hidden in the safe, about the photograph of my mother holding her son. I thought about Thomas, driving home with his wife and daughter, wearing a silver bracelet that had waited 38 years for a wrist. And I thought about the envelope that had started everything, the one that nearly broke my mother before it showed her who she really was. The truth is not always clean. It does not always arrive in a form that makes sense, but it arrives. And when it does, you can either turn away or you can open it. My mother opened it, and what she found on the other side was not destruction. It was the beginning of a life she had never let herself imagine. That is the only thing I know for certain. The secrets we carry are heavier than the truth we fear, and the moment we put them down, we discover we were strong enough to hold them all along. That was the night I understood something I had been missing my whole life. The people we love are not always the people we know, and the people we think we know are not always the ones we have been told about. My grandmother spent decades hiding a truth she thought would destroy us. Instead, it rebuilt us. Not overnight, not without pain, but thoroughly enough that when I look at my mother now, I see someone who is no longer carrying a weight that was never meant to be hers. I see someone who finally believes she deserves to be happy. The question that stays with me is not about the past. It is about the present. How many of us are walking around with pieces of ourselves hidden because we were told they would make us too complicated, too difficult, too much? How many of us have been shaped by silences that were never ours to keep? This story is specific. It belongs to a 17-year-old girl in Baltimore in 1985, to a son she never held, to a grandmother who waited until death to tell the truth. But the shape of it is universal. Every family has a version of this, a name that does not get spoken, a loss that does not get mourned out loud, a truth that waits in an envelope for someone brave enough to open it. I still have the photograph of my mother holding Thomas. I keep it in the same book of Emily Dickinson poems where my grandmother hid it, not because I need a reminder of the pain, but because I need a reminder that love survives almost everything, including the people who try to bury it. My mother and David are married now. Thomas calls her every Sunday. Eleanor calls her grandma. And my grandmother's grave gets fresh flowers once a month from someone who never knew her in life, but knows her better than most people did when she was alive. If there is a lesson in this, it is not complicated. The truth does not always arrive gently, but neither does a life lived in hiding. You can spend years protecting a secret that is crushing you, or you can put it down and see what happens. My mother put hers down the night she passed out in the kitchen, and look at what grew. If this story reached you, if it stayed with you, think about the silence in your own life. Not the one you chose, the one that chose you. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is open the envelope. Subscribe for more stories that reveal what happens when the truth finally speaks. And let us know in the comments,